In this video, I'm going to tell you 5 ways that you can 10x your growth as a photographer. This is 5 for Friday. Hi there. If this is the first time you're visiting my channel, my name is Adrian Cho. I'm a photographer and also a musician, and I also do a few other things as well. But nowadays I spend most of my time as a photographer, and mostly I photograph wildlife. And at this channel, I produce videos to help you get better as a photographer. We cover tips, tricks, tools, techniques, and when it matters, gear, and some other things too. In this series 5 for Friday, I discuss 5 things about a particular topic. And today we're going to talk about 5 ways that you can get better as a photographer really quickly. So let's get started. So first of all, let's talk about why this particular topic. So often I hear the question, sometimes it's asked to me and sometimes I hear it being asked to others, how long have you been a photographer? And sometimes you'll hear that question asked in other fields and other disciplines as well. And here's the thing, it's really a pretty irrelevant question, because there are people that have been doing things such as photography for a long time, for many decades, and some of them are still no good at it. In fact, some of them perhaps have been doing the same thing over and over and have never gotten any better in all of that time. And in fact, some of them perhaps even have gotten worse. On the flip side, there are people who perhaps have only been doing something for a short period of time, but somehow they're incredibly good at it. So what we're talking about is not so much how long someone has been doing something, but how good they are, and not just today, but also how good they are in the future. In other words, how good will they be in a month or in a year or in 5 years? So that's what the growth is all about, and that's why we want to talk about that today. What's this 10x thing all about? Well, 10 is just a number that is thrown out there, but the idea is that it's an order of magnitude greater than what might be the average. So in other words, if the average person takes X number of years to get to a certain state as a photographer, how could you possibly do that 10 times faster? Get there 10 times quicker than the average person would. It's a lofty goal. Perhaps it's attainable, perhaps not. Perhaps you can even surpass it. But what's most important is that if you want to get good at something, there's a bunch of things that you really need to think about doing, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I want to talk about is becoming highly efficient. In photography, there are many things that we do over and over and over. These are the routine things. Some of these things, like capturing images or editing images, are things that we do hundreds, perhaps even thousands of times per day. So it's really important that we become highly efficient at doing these things. Otherwise, it can really slow us down. I've seen people that take a really long time to edit their images. Sometimes they even have a backlog of images, things that they've shot months, even years ago, and they haven't even had a chance to look at them. When I go out and shoot, when I come back, I want to edit my images, perhaps not to a perfectly polished state, but certainly I want to edit them enough that I can learn from the experience that I've just had. I want to know if there are things that I need to do differently, if there are shots that I'm missing that I need to get, and I want to be able to show those images to other people perhaps and also get feedback on them as well. So it's really important that I can edit my images quickly. I have a particular way of editing, a workflow that I've showed many other people, and a lot of people have liked it, and so it's something that I do want to share in a video on this channel. That's editing, but of course other things such as taking shots, that's something that we do all the time. And in fact, we will capture more shots, take more shots than we'll edit. So it's an even more routine thing. That process of taking shots and of doing all the basic things such as exposing and composing and so forth, you have to be so practiced at those things and have them just down pat. So establish your workflows and then optimize the heck out of them. Always be looking for ways to make them better, to make them more efficient. And sometimes time really is of the essence. when you get out there and there is a photo opportunity that presents itself, sometimes you only have seconds to take a shot. And ideally you want to take more than just one shot. You want to take multiple shots, and perhaps at different focal lengths and different apertures and so forth, and really exploit that opportunity and leverage that opportunity. And so you really want to be prepared and have your workflows down. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of efficiency is knowing your fundamentals. It's really important that you know the basic things. Photography is somewhat of a technical process. You don't have to be a geek about this stuff, but you certainly have to know, for example, the exposure triangle, and you have to understand how aperture and ISO, sensitivity, and shutter speed play into your shots and play into exposure, and what it means to make those changes to those variables. There's a lot of fundamental things about photography, about the process of exposure and photography and light and so forth, as well as fundamental things about gear, about cameras, that it's important to really just have those things down and know them inside out so that you don't even have to think about it. And here's the bottom line. You want to have all of these routine things on autopilot so that you don't even have to think about them. Let me use an analogy from another discipline that I'm involved in a fair bit, and that's music. I've been playing music for a long time, lots of different instruments, and nowadays I play mostly the double bass or upright bass or stand-up bass, and I mostly play jazz. When I'm playing the instrument, where I put my hands and how I move my fingers and all these little mechanical things are all things that I don't even think about. They just happen on autopilot, and that's so important because it allows me then to focus my attention and my energy on other more important things, such as listening to the sound that I'm producing, listening to the sound that the band is producing, looking around the room and seeing how the audience is responding to what we're playing, and so forth. But I can't do any of those things if I have to focus on, where do I put my fingers and all these tiny little routine things. So it's so important to have that stuff just out of the way. And the same is true with photography. The second thing I want to talk about is getting comfortable with being outside of your comfort zone. So what I'm talking about here is that a lot of people keep doing the same thing over and over. And it's easy to do that. It's easy to fall into that trap because it feels good. It feels satisfying to do something that you know you can do well. But the only way to get better at something is to keep pushing yourself and do things that you're not good at. And that includes failing at things and trying again. An important part of getting outside of your comfort zone is also tightening your feedback loop. And that means that you look at your images very critically, and also that you get feedback on your images. You have other people look at them and ask their opinion and see if they have any feedback. It's very common for people to show others images, and people are always giving positive feedback, always saying, oh, that's fantastic, that's beautiful, that's nice. You see that on Instagram a lot, for example. It's like, nice capture, beautiful shot. You hardly ever see anyone say, well, it would be better if perhaps, you had composed it this way, or perhaps you could have had a greater depth of field here, or so forth. So getting that feedback is a really important thing. So really think about how you can push yourself, get outside of your comfort zone, do the things that you're not used to doing, and that will really help you grow a lot faster. One more thing about getting comfortable with being out of your comfort zone. Set yourself photographic challenges. What I'm talking about here is setting yourself a challenge where you go out with your camera or cameras and you constrain yourself in some way. You put limits on yourself. To give you an example of this, recently I was on a trip in Svalbard looking for polar bears, and I was in a group, and when we would get to a location where there were bears or where we thought that might be something interesting to photograph, we would go out in Zodiacs, little boats deployed from the ship, and cruise around and photograph from the Zodiacs. I decided when we got to one location, there was no bear there, but there was a possibility of some other things, that I would stay on the ship and photograph from the ship. So everyone else went out, and I was on the ship photographing for a while and getting some shots of birds and some landscape shots from the ship. And eventually the fog rolled in, and it was just really thick fog, and you couldn't see anything around the ship at all. It was just zero visibility. So I went inside and I decided to set myself a challenge. I decided that I would use one of my cameras with one of my lenses, which was an 85mm lens, and that I would shoot images wide open. That means at the widest aperture, or f1.8, and that I would render all the shots in black and white, and that I would take shots of things inside the ship that people would have to guess what they were. In other words, I made a game out of it, so that when people came back from the zodiacs, that I would show them the images and they would have to guess what it was that I had taken a photo of. And it was fun. It was a great game to play with them, and also it was a great challenge for me to try to do that and push me to do things that I wouldn't normally do, perhaps to use my gear in a way that I normally wouldn't, and get myself out of my comfort zone. And that's a really important thing to do. So think about setting challenges as a way to do that. The third thing we're going to talk about now is developing high contextual awareness. What do I mean by this? Well, what I'm talking about is developing the ability to read a situation and then figure out how to respond appropriately, and also how to read and predict a changing situation. So when we come across a scene, a location where we could possibly take an image, there are all kinds of variables that are part of that scene. There is the weather, there's the light, there's the foreground, the background, the subject, and so forth. And figuring out what these elements are and how they're changing is so important. Light, for example, is one of the most important, if not the most important element in photographs. Knowing how to read light, understanding the quality of light, understanding color temperature, all of these things are just so important. Knowing, for example, if you photograph animals, how to read and predict animal behavior. If you're photographing people, how to also read their behavior and where it is appropriate to give them direction. Knowing how to read the weather if you're shooting outside. All of these things are just so important. And often we get photo opportunities and we don't have a lot of time to make the most of them. So it's really important that you are ready at the time that something happens. And that often means that you have to do some preparation beforehand. And that really means that you need to be looking at something and saying, oh, well, okay, I see now that, for example, that cloud is going to move in front of the sun, and that means, that I'll have to change my exposure, or I can see that that fox is going to go up at the top of the hill there. All of these kinds of things, depending on what the genre is that you're shooting. Usually, most scenes are not entirely static, and you often can't control every single element. And so, especially in those situations where you have a lot of unknowns or a lot of things that you can't control, and that's the case in wildlife photography. We can't control finding the animals. We often can't control when we find them, what they do, and exactly where they go and how they behave. We can't control the weather. We can't control the light. We generally use all natural light, and we don't use any artificial light sources. So being able to know all of these elements and understand how they all come together, and also knowing how they will change over time, that's all super important. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about is learning to shoot in all kinds of environments. Especially if you're a nature photographer or a wildlife photographer, a lot of the best shots will come from being in positions that might require you to perform gymnastics. You might be lying down, you might be lying on your back, you might be on an incline, lying down. You might be in a vehicle. You might have to shoot out the window of a vehicle or out the top of a vehicle. The vehicle would be moving. You could be in a boat that's bobbing up and down. You could be in snow or on ice. You could be in the water up to your waist or your armpits with chest waders on, of course. There's all kinds of situations that you may have to find yourself in, or that you would want to be in to get the best possible shots. And sometimes that's where the unique shots will happen, because others may not go to those positions or places to get those shots. So one of the things that's important is that you don't let your, where possible, you don't let your physical abilities limit you. You may have to train a little bit to get better core strength, to get better endurance, because you may have to hike, for example, to places where there's a fantastic photo opportunity. Another thing that's really important is a lot of people shoot from a tripod, and sometimes that's great and it's appropriate, but don't let yourself be constrained by a tripod or monopod. You should be able to handhold your equipment, at least for brief periods of time, and some of the best shots may come from hand-holding. And if you are hand-holding, you can generally move around quicker and respond quicker to whatever might be happening at a particular place. So get comfortable with shooting in all of these different kinds of situations, and that includes cold weather, for example. It's quite difficult to shoot in cold weather. Sometimes your fingers are freezing up, and you have to deal with falling snow that you might have to manually focus through. There's all of these kinds of things that are really important, especially if you're photographing outdoors and especially if you're photographing wildlife, that you really need to become adept at dealing with. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is practicing your butt off. So the first thing is that the concept of even practicing photography is something that is sometimes foreign to some people. So let's use another music analogy. If you took up a musical instrument, you wouldn't just play that instrument for a few hours every second or third weekend. No, you would actually be practicing a few hours probably every day. You would also have a teacher, and you'd practice a lot at home, and then you'd go out into the field and you would perform, and then you would learn from those experiences. And that is the case with photography too. You have to practice all of these techniques, and also practice using your gear. It doesn't really matter whether or not you have the best gear. In fact, having the best gear doesn't necessarily make you a better photographer. However, having crappy gear or gear that frustrates you can definitely hold you back. But what's most important is that whatever the gear is that you have complete mastery over it. And having that mastery over your gear means having to practice with it and understand the limitations, knowing, for example, what is the aperture of a particular lens that lens is sharpest. So practicing is really important. And going back to the first point about using your time efficiently, using your practice time efficiently, that is also so important. I come across people sometimes who will tell me with regards to music that they're too old to learn an instrument, and that is complete rubbish. Because here's the thing, when you are younger, especially when you're a kid, you don't use your time very efficiently. And going back to being getting comfortable with being outside of your comfort zone, the reason why, especially as a kid, you don't use your time efficiently is because you tend to practice the things that you can already do, and you'll practice them over and over. And while that might be satisfying, it doesn't help you get better. The thing that you need to do is to use your time efficiently in practice is to practice the things that you're not good at. So doing that is just so important. Using your practice time efficiently. When we get older and we have commitments, we have family and work commitments, we don't have as much time, and we want to make the best use of our time, our practice time. So here's the thing, especially if you're new to photography, don't just be shooting every second or third weekend. You need to be out there as much as you can. And if you have a day job and other things that are going on during the day, try to get out early in the morning or late in the evening. That's when the light is typically the best anyway. But think about how you will practice and make sure that you practice, because as I said, practice is actually, to many people, it's a foreign concept in photography. The idea when you say, I will go out and practice, I'm going to go out and practice photography, people look at you strangely, but it's really something that you need to do in order to get better. So let's recap. Number 1, become highly efficient. Establish your workflows and optimize the heck out of them continuously. Always look for ways to make them more efficient. Know your fundamentals like the exposure triangle inside out. And the bottom line is, be so practiced in all of these things that you can do them with very little effort. These are the things that you need to have on autopilot so that you can spend the majority of your time and attention on other more important things, such as reading situations and being creative. The second thing, get comfortable with being out of your comfort zone. This means trying things that you don't normally do, it means experimenting, and it means getting good at learning from failing. Tighten your feedback loop by getting feedback on your images and be highly critical of your own work. The third thing, develop high contextual awareness. Learn how to quickly read situations and figure out how to respond, and learn how to predict how a situation might change. The fourth thing, learn to shoot in all kinds of environments. Get fit and get flexible so that your physical abilities don't limit how and where you shoot, and don't be constrained by your tripod or monopod. And finally, practice your butt off. Practice regularly and figure out how to use your practice time as efficiently as possible. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post below. I'll do my very best to answer any questions and respond to any comments. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. I've got lots of other great stuff coming out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.